Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kayla and my presentation. It's called Recognizing Inaccessibility and Ableism on the Journey Towards Inclusion and Community-Based Programming. The logos which are hidden are 4-H Upham Woods and University of Wisconsin Extension. So, okay, great. So here's our little agenda today. We're going to do a little bit of introduction, and then we're going to try to define inclusion because everyone has a different definition of inclusion. And then we're going to kind of share our journey because we don't want to come here with all the answers. We definitely learned some things, but we also recognize we still have a way to go. And we really have some resources that we want to share. So you are all leaving here maybe ready to incorporate inclusion into your programming as well. And so here is our bios. So my name is Rachael. I use she, her pronouns. I am the on-site and accessibility coordinator at Upham Woods Outdoor Learning Center. And so I really am fortunate to think about accessibility for everyone who comes to visit us. I tend to focus on disability inclusion because that is like my experience and my passions. But for example, we have some school groups coming next week and some of the students are participating in Ramadan and celebrating that. And so accessibility also goes towards how can they have a great experience while they're potentially fasting and needing to pray and things like that.
Great. Hi, everyone. Kayla Oberstadt here. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm with the Wisconsin 4-H program. I support the southern region, which is 21 counties for professional development. But beyond that, I support expanding access across the whole state. So what does expanding access mean in youth programs? It's literally anyone who's not currently served. We want to expand that access to welcome them in. It's not specific to a demographic. It's not specific to a gender. It is anybody who we're not reaching. Let's bring you in. Specifically, my work has been with gender inclusion and making sure that we have relevant language so that youth know that when they come to an overnight program, that they're going to be assigned a cabin that's comfortable for them and safe for them, and that their personal names and chosen names are going to be recognized when they're in our spaces, because the data shows the importance between those safeguards. So really cool stuff that's happening, and I'm happy to work with Rachael on what we do at our camp programs.
Yep, if you all have questions at any time, feel free to raise your hand and let us know. Just a little bit about, oh, it's still you. Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought it was
About our program. So this is audience participation. When you see 4-H, big green clover, or kiddos doing awesome things like this, what words come to mind? So if you're in the chat, if you're on Zoom, please feel free to jump in. When you hear 4-H or see that clover, what do you think of?
County fair.
County fair is one, absolutely. Agriculture.
Hands, hard.
Yeah.
There's two other reasons that I don't know.
Yeah.
Hands, health, and
You got it. So what the actual 4-H's are standing for, that's great. So things that I might not have heard, so we click on to the next thing is leadership, community, everyone belongs, building these connections. So you see some of the photos, it is agriculture, but it's also healthy living. It's also science, technology, and engineering. It's also a place for all. We want to make sure that people recognize, because we are a 4-H program, we are research-based. This is not something of just having adults out there doing cool things in their community. These are adults who are background checked and have their volunteer training done so that we are accountable to doing the right things for our kiddos. As of March 2023, we have nearly 24,000 youth enrolled across the state. There are 825 clubs, which are based out of communities or after school programs. And in order to do all that cool stuff, we have 4,575 adult volunteers, which could be you if you want to know more. Let's talk after. So that is 4-H in a nutshell.
Great, and now Upham Woods in a nutshell, which I thought was earlier. So we focus on environmental and leadership education, and we have 318 acres of forest land along the Wisconsin River up in Wisconsin Dells. We say we served over 12,000 visitors annually. That was definitely pre-COVID. Last year we only got to 6,000, but I think it's pretty good. And that's through 50 plus partnership organizations, including local schools, 4-H groups, scout troops, and more. So 4-H groups account for about 13 organizations. We count each individual county or whoever we work with as in a different organization, but that means we have 37 other organizations that we are working with and bringing onto our site, because we usually do place-based education. We will sometimes go out to places, but it's mostly on site. And so if we want, you all can respond electronically. You can also yell it out, but thinking about inclusion, right? We threw out these big numbers of 12,000, 24,000, but what does that actually mean? How are we including everyone? And so you should be able to text or go to this online thing and tell us what inclusion means to you. Again, you can also type it in the chat or just tell me out loud what inclusion means to you. Check that this works.
I think I got the right link.
Oh,
There we go.
belonging. Yes, we love the belonging word.
So since that was the first one, I'm actually going to share one of the 4 key elements of 4-H is belonging, mastery, generosity, and leadership.
It's, yeah, so my last name is Lewandowski and Rachael spelled A-E-L. And so if it's not working,
I like this.
kindness. Yeah,
Not having to ask for your needs to be met.
innocence. If anyone would like to expand upon what they said.
Yeah, innocence, I feel like kids,
Aw.
young people have so much to grapple with. You know, just if they tune into what's happening in the world, especially in the state of Wisconsin. You know, so young people are having to grow up sooner than.
Yeah.
Than most of us.
In the interest of time, I'm gonna move on. I see someone still typing. Do you want to just tell me? Do you want to just tell us what you were thinking? No?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just still trying to get this little.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna move on, which is gonna shut it down. So if you just want to tell us what you were gonna say.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is welcome, everybody belongs.
Yeah.
Everybody needs that. So really, everybody captured it.
Yes. Well, and one thing we like to think about, which this video will highlight, is the difference between inclusion and just like being there. Because sometimes access is not inclusion.
Yes.
And so this is a minute-long video that I hope works for the people online. Well, and for us, I guess.
More prevalent in education and childcare settings, some children continue to experience exclusion. As a society, we no longer tell families that their disabled child must live in an institution instead of their home. But some kids with disabilities are left out or are intentionally excluded from their communities. Children with disabilities can also experience segregation. It is quite common for community recreation and schools to offer classes only for children with disability. Some families prefer this type of setting. The problem is when this is the only option. Sometimes child and youth programs intend to be inclusive, however, are unable to provide support. This leads to integration instead of inclusion. Integration is when children and youth with disabilities are present in a program with non-disabled peers, but not supported in ways that lead to meaningful participation. This may lead you to ask, what exactly is disability inclusion? Disability inclusion is both a way of thinking and a practice. It's the belief that children with and without disabilities belong in the community programs of their choosing. In practice, inclusion means making programs accessible to all children through changes that support participation. These changes are often called accommodations.
So yeah, we will like that definition. And going back to some of the things people put in, one of the responses to what does inclusion mean, not having to ask for what you need, I think is very interesting. I think we can never know what everyone needs, so there definitely needs to be a conversation there, which usually results in an ask, but it's definitely important because you can't necessarily meet everyone's need by design. So we're gonna go through a few examples. Oh no, don't start again. Of how we've been doing a journey towards inclusion. So this was last summer. This was my first summer working at Upham, was, you know, a year into my job, but kind of our first overnight experiences. And I got this email 2 days before camp. Hey, it's all arranged. You'll have 2 ASL interpreters on site next week. How would you all respond to that email?
Awesome, great. I didn't know that we had somebody who needed an ASL interpreter.
Yeah. So the Division of Extension, which we both work for, has decided to centralize funding for things like ASL interpreters, because they find that like individual programs like Upham Woods might not have $3,000 to support an ASL interpreter. But the division itself might have that money that they can distribute to individual programs. However, that means somebody wanted to come to our camp and put in a request through Extension for an ASL interpreter. And Extension's like, great, we got it. And then they didn't tell us. And so we're like, what do you mean an ASL interpreter is coming next week? I have 3 groups on site next week. Which group? They're like, oh, it's 5 County. Great. 5 County has 4th graders who are learning about animals and 8th graders who are doing leadership development with a 3-hour hike. Which group? Oh, I don't know how old the kid is. I need to know how old this child is, because being inclusive for people who are deaf isn't just about an ASL interpreter. There are other supports that can be provided for that youth, who happens to be in this picture, this child right here. And then this is our ASL interpreter and our teacher, who decided to bring out a whiteboard to help support that visual learning, so it's not all verbal learning. And so as an outdoor program, we don't always lug around giant whiteboards when we're outside, but we decided to for this week. And moving forward, since we have more than 2 days notice, we have other solutions for this. Like we've laminated just white pieces of paper, and you can just write on those little white pieces of paper. So it's light, it's easy, it's small, but it supports that visual learning, which is beneficial not only for deaf participants, but for everyone. And so I think that's also part of inclusion, is not just supporting people with disabilities, but it's supporting everyone. So some of the things we did last summer, we had a quick meeting on deaf culture, because deaf is a culture, and some common ASL signs. So if the interpreter's not around, you know that like putting a T in your hand, I don't know where the camera is, means I have to go to the toilet, right? Or just like, hey, if you're someone, do you want us to just say like, good morning, right? Like that's a very common thing, like, good morning, how are you? Like everyone should be able to have that in their language. We put some auto captions on PowerPoints, and we made some visual aids. Some things that were missed. We didn't think about swimming and lifeguards, and the fact that lifeguards blow whistles at people, and the deaf child cannot hear the whistles being blown. We decided we have a campfire and we sing camp songs. Maybe some of you experienced that. It's dark at a campfire, so they might not be able to hear see the interpreter. And camp songs, A, go really fast, and B, are really weird, like, right? And so the interpreter's like, what are you saying? Like, I can't even interpret it anyways, right? And then they have cabin time where they get to go back to their cabin, take a nap, change for swimming, whatever, but there was a male interpreter at that point. That male interpreter cannot go into that little girl cabin, right? Because of what they're doing. Then all of a sudden that little girl didn't have access to language during that cabin time. And then access to information by the parent. Parent got the same email I got. It's all arranged. There's an ASL interpreter. And that parent's like, what is happening to my child? And so the parent actually decided to chaperone, which shouldn't have to happen. That parent shouldn't have to take 3 days off of work to come make sure their child has a good time. However, at the end of it all, we talked about these things that we missed, these things that we did well, and the parent said the words I love to hear. Next year, my child will come without me. So they chose to come back, and she's like, you all can handle this. I don't need to be there. And she did come back. This was 2 weekends ago at our art camp. So there they are again, and we have our interpreters. But some of the other things we're doing is we're trying to change some of our accommodation forms. So I put an example right here where we talk about accommodations beyond the law, beyond ADA, beyond like you have a disability. So do you have any mobility concerns like having a wheelchair, which is covered under ADA, or maybe you just have a broken leg, which isn't really covered under ADA, or you have a sprained ankle? Do you have students who need differentiated instruction? Do you have medical concerns that may impact programming like diabetes, anaphylactic reaction to bees? Like people might not think of those as accommodations. And so under our old form, it's like, do you have any accommodation requests? We would often get blanks, but some of these things are really important. And then we've also been working towards universal design of some of our classes. So that way, like we just have visual aids at all of our classes, not just for our youth that might be deaf and need that, but for all students who benefit from visual aids.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to share though is, as Rachel and I were putting this together, like I continue to learn, right? I am learning from my co-presenters. I'm learning from folks that I interact with in programs like this. I wasn't aware that capital D for deaf community is a proper noun. And so like that was something I learned during the process of putting this presentation together. And it just goes to show how much identity is housed in somebody's needs and recognizing it as a part of affiliation. So going to more of like the 4-H and extension side, we have some policy updates and staff training, not just for camps, but for youth programs. So one of them specifically for base camp, which is an overnight program that takes place in cabins. Base camp versus outpost camp. Outpost camp is staying in tents or a little bit more roughing it in the wilderness, but there's still an organized setting. Base camp is typically, we've got camp counselors, teenagers who are housed in the cabin with youth. So one of the expectations from University of Wisconsin-Madison for vulnerable populations is that our teenagers are going to be trained on certain things, like why we have a rule of 3. It's never going to be a one-on-one, even though they're both minors. We want to protect the youth and also the adult or the teenager, that there would never be an accusation. So it's a rule of 3. We also have in the policy gender identity recognition. So this is something that is part of our policy that all camps, anybody who does an overnight program, will recognize that it's not just boys and girls in cabins. We recognize the gender identity which someone registers for will be acknowledged in our programs. And again, that's very specific to extension, protection of vulnerable populations from abuse and harassment. Who else are vulnerable populations? Those with a disability. So recognizing why it's important to train our staff. And then our next slide tells us a little bit more about what kind of things we have done to help make this happen. We've got 72 counties across Wisconsin. Not all of them camp, some of them camp together. But we have already done an online accessibility training through our colleague with the McBurney Disability Center, where they got to answer questions in live time. Hey, this is what I experienced last year. How do we make that better for this coming year? And the outcome of that is Heather has now given her time every 2 weeks on a Tuesday morning for office hours. A 4-H educator doesn't have to plan ahead to ask, how am I going to manage this situation with this teenage camp counselor who needs something or this young person who needs somebody? I can call Heather at any time. But if I want to be able to talk to her, I'm jumping online on Tuesday at 10 o'clock or whatever it is and know that she will be there for me. What's great about that? Other educators might be dropping into that room, learning from it in live time as well. Along with other staff training pieces, actually it'll go to what's next is how do they request accommodations? And we've got breaking news here, folks. Those accommodations are going to be much wider spread through the Dean's Innovation Grant. We were just recognized with nearly $40,000. So
I did like 3 days ago.
yes, we like had a placeholder in the slides for this. And the Innovation Grant was specific to make sure that it was expanded audiences. It was cross institute programming, and that it is serving a need. That's statewide, not just one specific demographic. So some of the funds for adaptive equipment, such as like in our Northwoods, a lot of our winter sports, a sit ski, so that they can be out cross country skiing with their campmates. In the water and summer sports, a kayak, adaptive movable seats, transfer seat, right?
That's part of it, and they also have, I call them training wheels, but they're little buoyancies on the side of the kayak that help you from tipping if you don't have as much trunk support.
Yeah.
And the key with this is it is shared adaptive equipment. So an adaptive kayak or a sit ski can cost a few $1,000s. And so are we gonna buy one of those for every 72 counties and then they sit in our closet, potentially not being used, or potentially the person running that, the educator in that county doesn't know how to use it? But instead, it's going to be like 1 or 2 pieces strategically located around the state so we can share these resources and share these expertise, because that makes us all more effective. And it also relieves stress from individual educators who in the past have felt pressure to know about all this disability, like justice and access and adaptive equipment work, when it's really like there are key people potentially who already know this, and we can like help alleviate some of that.
Yeah, so that's very exciting. And along with that, we also need money to help our educators be trained. People across the state come together for 4-H regional meetings once every few months. So part of our funding is going to allow for an overnight stay, so that when I lead a Southern region meeting, typical Southern region agenda for the whole day, spend the night, and the next day we're doing all things adaptations. And that's going to be covered. You don't have to pay for the overnight stay. Part of it's going to be at camp. So learn by doing, live by doing, right? We're going to be there accessing these supplies. And then we'll do that again in the Northern region and the Eastern region.
And I think one thing that's important to say about this that we haven't yet is that we didn't just be like, this is what everyone needs, and we did like a hands down approach. We asked 4-H educators, we asked parents of people with disabilities, we asked actual youth had disabilities to come up with things that they wanted.
We have some questions coming through.
No, it's just a comment.
Okay, cool. So other things, what else is coming next in Wisconsin 4-H? One of my program areas or professional development areas in expanding access is a statewide committee. And in the time that I've started, we have grown from a LGBTQIA champions group, which existed for like the last 2 years. I have recruited somebody who's actually at this conference who wants to lead a military youth champions group. What are the specific needs that military families and young people need? Because that's a vulnerable population. They have different sets of interests and needs to thrive. How about tribal nations? Absolutely. Like just being here for the lunch hour and knowing how intentional that is, to know that our young people would be included in 4-H when they see themselves represented in guest speakers and presentations. It's also important to teach the rest of our colleagues about why this is important. And then disability populations. As of last week, an educator said, we're doing great stuff. Why don't we have the champions group yet? And I said, because we need you to volunteer to lead it. And she said, I would love to, right? Like we need to be able to connect the pieces. You'll notice that maybe we don't have something here for like Hispanic or Latinx. It's not because it's not needed. It's simply we don't have the staff capacity yet. But what we do have is a group of colleagues who are willing to be part of a translation task force with me so that we can bring things to the Office of Access and Inclusion to be able to translate documents in a little bit more of a streamlined way instead of everybody trying to do it their own. So that is also something that we are looking forward to in Wisconsin 4-H. And one of those pieces, I think one of our colleagues on OAIC is on Zoom today, is I had this goal of a simplified enrollment form, 1-page 4-H demographics. I want this in Spanish and we want it by the end of March, and it is out there. so it is a process, and we're very happy to make that happen.
Awesome. And so some of the things that Upham Woods is doing beyond what we've already said is we want to be part of this accessible equipment network. So we have some of the stuff we're going to purchase through our grant, but we're also working with organizations like Accessibility Wisconsin, which provide outdoor all-terrain wheelchairs. Their goal is to get one in every single county. And so what they do is they look for host organizations that host it at their site with a trailer. And so people would either be able to use it on site at Upham Woods or hook the trailer up to their car, take it away to wherever they want to and bring it back. That has been with the UW legal system for 8 months at this point. So we are so close. I got promised it would be signed by the end of the month, and now it's in 27. So we'll see. We also got a Wisconsin Idea Collaboration Grant for Nature Navigator STEM Camp for neurodiverse learners. Part of that video was that sometimes people with disabilities want space that is just people with disabilities. And so this camp is specifically going to be designed for neurodiverse learners, which includes like youth with autism, and other like communication disorders and things like that, where they can come together in a space that's just for them to learn and potentially build community, because affinity group space can be super valuable. And we've also been running some other events that are labeled as accessible events. So the Natural Resource Foundation runs field trips, and we're running some accessible field trips for them. Because again, in the outdoors, people are always like, oh, Conqueror, we have to climb this 3-mile long mountain or we didn't get outside. And it's like, no, there are many ways to be outside. And then there's this program near Milwaukee called Out We Go, run by the Wisconsin DNR, which maybe you've heard of. It's a free for youth, $5 for adults day, where all these different organizations are coming together to provide introductory activities. So some people are leading fishing, some people are leading kayaking, we're leading accessible birding, because apparently I know about birds. And then I have some resources for you. Thankfully, this is recorded, so you don't have to take quick notes. But the McBurney Disability Resource Center on campus is super helpful. The Office of Access, Inclusion, and Compliance, a specific extension department that helps with this. So if you all want to partner with extension, we can get you access to that. Accessibility Wisconsin is great. Aging and Disability Resource Centers are really great. They've helped us with a lot of our transportation problems at Upham, where in a rural area, that's you have to drive to. But they can provide buses for people that are aging or disabled, which is some people. Disability Pride Madison's great. Got some checklists. This book, Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be a Great Ally. Super good, super new. Making outdoor programs accessible. All of those are great. And I think we did great. We have 6 minutes for questions and another beautiful picture of us canoeing outside. And I love that child in the middle who's just like, we did it. There is one question that came in online from someone who said, accessibility first infrastructure is so important. It's great when instructors already have accessibility features implemented within their courses, rather than forcing students with disabilities to go through bureaucratic processes and out themselves. And I agree. I think that's why it can be super important to hire people with disabilities for these jobs. It can really help you think about things that maybe someone who's not disabled wouldn't think about. And it's also like, at least in our process, I never ask for a diagnosis. We are like, what accommodations do you need? Oh, you need an ASL interpreter? Great. But it could also be simple like, oh, you need a hike that's only half a mile instead of 3 miles. Great. I'm not going to call you lazy. I'm not going to assume you don't need that. We're just going to do that. Like, you don't need to tell me what you need. Are there other questions or comments? Yes.
I was just curious if you send out anything like ahead of time, like I'm just thinking of children on autism spectrum, like a social story would be super helpful.
Yeah, I have a collection of social stories I can send out. The trick with Upham Woods, at least, is we act really as a rental facility. And so like schools bring their group in. And so usually you're only coordinating with like the lead teacher or the like scout troop leader, whomever. And so that can make some of that difficult. But we do have some pre-made social stories for common things like archery. You know, when you arrive, you're going to have to leave your bag somewhere. Well, you go to orientation, but your bag's not going to be touched, like common things like that. We do have social stories. Social stories. So youth with autism or like youth with even just like anxiety or whatever, they often need routine and structure. And so social stories are a very like concrete way to let them know like A, what's going to happen, and B, like kind of some acceptable like regular responses. And so one of our social stories says like, I will arrive at Upham Woods on a bus. When I get off the bus, there will be a bathroom and water available, but I might have to wait a few minutes for someone to tell me where they are, right? So that they're not like nervous immediately. I will have to leave my bag in the lobby while I go to orientation. my bag will be guarded by an adult, so I don't need to be nervous that someone's gonna steal my stuff. Like things like that, that like maybe the rest of us, we're okay with uncertainty, but they might need that reassurance and like routine and knowledge before. Yeah. Yeah, it's usually words and a picture together. There's even some great apps now that like, you don't have to like do them in a Word document like I always do.
One of the other things that I would like to share, when it comes to accessibility, especially with camps and overnight programs, I've only been in my position in Wisconsin for 6 months, but previously was older youth and military kids program manager in Ohio for Ohio State University 4-H. And I wrote a document on guidance for working animals. So service animal is a requirement, is an attachment of a human who requires that service. But what about therapy dogs? We saw one today at our program. What's the implications of an adult staff bringing a therapy animal to support the rest of the campers? What about an individual who has an emotional support animal who by housing authority has the right to have their emotional support animal in overnight rental accommodations, but not necessarily short-term camp accommodations? So a whole document on like, how do we best make this possible for a young person and their dog? And maybe it's not the youth, maybe it's the adult chaperone, right? So thanks again to our friends at the McBurney Center. They've taken my document from Ohio State University branding. Gonna look at what it looks like for University of Wisconsin. How do college students operate with an emotional support animal to be successful? What does that look like in the dormitories? Well, how's that going to transfer to a 4-H camp, an outdoor program? So I'm really excited to see that, and didn't put a slide on it because I haven't yet had the experience in Wisconsin of somebody bringing their animal to a program, but I hope to see it sometime soon. So. Any other questions or thoughts?
Do you have a rope course?
We have what's considered a low ropes challenge course, so nothing's more than 5 feet off the ground. And so I have lugged, we have portable wheelchair ramps that'll get people onto different elements, but some of that is in the facilitator training, because like, again, just because you have that ramp doesn't mean that's accessible.
And the low ropes course is through the hill, over the river, and through the woods. Not quite to.
Oh yeah, and like
house,
up
it is
80 steps, but there's a way to drive.
Yes, there is. But just recognizing like upon immediate look, it'd be like, how is this person gonna get there? We're gonna drive. Or for one of the other camps that I've worked at, it was an ATV. Like we needed a 6-wheeler. Like you're gonna get up there because you can participate in the activities, but you're not going to be able to get there on your own. But we're going to make that happen.
Do you know any sensory items or sensory filters?
We do, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing we've been, at least at Upham, we've been struggling with lately is that in the past, this was not made a priority. And so like we had to write a grant in order to afford an accessible kayak. We at Upham Woods owned 40 canoes. We couldn't have bought, whenever that was budgeted, one accessible kayak when we bought those 40 canoes. And so some of it is like catching up to things that should have already been done, but it was assumed like, oh, people with disabilities maybe don't want to go canoeing. And it's like, no, everyone wants
a canoe.
No, some people don't want to canoe, and that's fine, but we shouldn't make that choice for people.
Yes.
The photo of this from the area about that flashbacks.
No, especially because we're on a river, we have an emergency pontoon, because sometimes you radio like there are kids floating down the river. Yeah.
There is a current. It's not a lake. They won't stop.
Basically, you're adding things.
Yeah.
And then the other great thing actually about the grant that we'll be doing is getting media footage and photography and video footage so that people can see themselves represented at camp. So paying and making that investment in media relations, because if someone doesn't know that they're welcome because they've not seen it, that will really change the game.
Well, and that could be a whole nother conversation of like, how do you take pictures of these people without like, calling them out, marginalizing them. But when we talked to parents of kids with disabilities, they're like, this is what we want to know my kid is safe coming there. And so there's that balance of like making sure you're taking pictures of people that are actually coming. Like every picture in here has actually been people that have been at Upham Woods. So like if we look at the beginning here, like we had an accessible birding event that wasn't at Upham Woods, but we let it. And like this kid right here, this is the all-terrain wheelchair that we've gone through Accessibility Wisconsin, and he got to come and do archery and stuff, and that really helped him get around campus, which is not accessible because it's outside.